I absolutely love the Dunk and Egg Novellas. They're my favourite part of A Song of Ice and Fire, so I was very nervous about the HBO adaptation, especially after it was delayed and had fairly extensive reshoots. Yes, George R. R. Martin, after seeing the first episode, has said he was very pleased with it in a blog post. These kind of things are never a good sign. But more than that, many fans, including myself to some extent, do feel a little bit burned by HBO, given the poor final season of Game of Thrones, and the utter mismanagement of House of the Dragon Season 2, which has soured many people's anticipation for the idea of a third spin-off. People have lost trust in the brand and the reputation of HBO and the Game of Thrones IP, and it's going to take something special to win these people back, if they can at all. From this first trailer of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, I think this show does have the potential to do just that. The success of this show is very important to the future of Game of Thrones as an IP, and the future of the in-development spin-offs that are supposed to follow House of the Dragon. If Dunk and Egg doesn't hit it out of the park, and Season 3 of House of the Dragon also misses, I fear for the long-term future of the IP, so I think there's a lot riding on this show, not just for HBO, but also the fans' trust as well. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details of this video, I want to talk about the overall tone of the trailer and what that means for the tone of the show. The novellas are a lot more light-hearted than the main book series. That's not to say nothing serious happens in the books. It's not a comedy. The way they approach the drama and the story is markedly different to the main books. Much of this comes via the relationship and dynamic between Duncan and Egg. The use of colour also jumps out at me. The reason I loved Season 1 of Game of Thrones is because of the wonderful use of colour and just how vibrant and alive the King's Landing scenes felt versus, say, those at the Wall. As soon as Season 2 actually, the vibrance disappeared, and over time the show became more grey and brown. I get this idea was supposed to reflect how winter was coming and how the war had made the world a darker place to live, but even then there was a sheer lack of colour. Now House of the Dragon did do a lot to address this issue. There is a lot more colour present, especially in the early first season. But for some reason, whatever they did during the grading process of House of the Dragon resulted in almost everything being very washed out. While the colour was there, you can see it, it seemed to come across very flat. From what we've seen from this trailer, so far at least, it does seem a lot more vibrant than Game of Thrones, but still with the mix of moody and darkness that's vital for, say, the Trial of Seven. It seems they might have got the balance between the two right. The music also really stood out to me, given how very different it was from both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. And as much as I love Raim Djawadi's score for both those shows and how iconic they are, it's nice to have a new, fresh approach to the music, a different style from a new composer. I think it will really help Dunk and Egg forge an image of its own, and not just say Game of Thrones 2.0. Now while this all looks good on paper, it all comes back to one key point. Does the vibe and feeling, the light-hearted tone of this trailer represent what the show will actually be like? There are whole editing teams whose job it is to make trailers, with the key goal being selling the show. How many times have you seen a trailer for a show or a movie, then actually gone and seen it, and it be utterly different than what the trailer was selling you? I really hope this is not the case of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and what we see is what we will get. In this opening few sequences, we get a good look at who Duncan is. A more casual viewer is going to get an idea of what his character is about. He was a squire whose knight, Sir Arlyn, had just died, and the fact he's also not a very well-off knight, coming from a less privileged background than we're used to seeing. It does make me wonder if at all we're going to get any interaction with Sir Arlyn. Are we going to see him as he's dying to get some backstory across to the viewer that would otherwise be Dunk's internal monologue? Or are we going to cold open at his death and Duncan's solitary funeral for him? This next little moment of Duncan being asked to move by the stable boy is exactly what I mean by the tone of the show. The sarcastic comment asking if he's Baelor Targaryen is not only just light-hearted and funny, but gets across to the viewer that Duncan is not some privileged lord or tawny knight. He's literally at the bottom of the social ladder, with all these people he's now interacting with looking down on him, which further fuels his own insecurities and imposter syndrome about being a knight. So this little moment shows us the duality of the story. Despite the tone, under the surface it tackles so many larger and darker issues. Now the reason I've picked out this still here is to kind of prove a point. Just because the show is a much smaller story on a much smaller scale, lacking the magic and dragons and larger battles, does not mean it can still not be compelling and cinematic and visually interesting for the viewer. In fact, in a smaller story such as this, you rely on cinematography so much more because you don't have the huge set pieces to use as a crutch. Dexter Soul as Egg very much looks the part and sounds just how I thought he would in my head when I first read the book. In fact, it's not too dissimilar to how Harry Lloyd portrays his parts in the audiobook, which in my opinion is a good thing because the audiobook is fantastic. While I know it's always been a big nitpick of mine that the Targaryens don't have purple eyes in the show, there is something about Egg in this trailer. Maybe the contrast of his blue eyes and very pale skin with the bald head, and how he stands out from everyone else in the scenes around him, that somewhat makes him look otherworldly, which is very much how Targaryens are described in the book. I also think not having the purple eyes is going to maintain the plot twist about his true identity a little longer, where seeing this kid with purple eyes would just set off alarm bells about his true identity. The relationship between Duncan and Egg is the heart of the story, thus their dynamic was always going to be important to get right. From the interaction between them we have seen so far in the trailer, it does seem like they've nailed it. However, something I could not get out of my head while watching this trailer is for some reason it reminded me a lot of the video game Kingdom Come Deliverance. The music is a very similar vibe, the lightheartedness and use of humour, but it's more than that. Duncan sounds, to me at least, very much like Henry Skillets. Now that's not a complaint, I love those games, and would not be surprised if some inspirations were taken from them, given the time period and the setting. If I close my eyes when Peter Claffey is talking as Duncan, I swear you can almost hear Tom McKay's Henry. We see this new Targaryen banner as well, that I'm sure George R. R. Martin will love because the dragon has the correct number of legs for once. It's not wholly clear whose banner this is. The trailer implies it was Aerion given we cut to him next, but if that was the case, I would be a little bit disappointed, as I hoped we would see all the different personal Targaryen sigils and heraldry, Aerion's modified dragon banner, Maekar's 4 dragons, Valar's own take. But some have suggested this could just be Baelor arriving, hence the standard Targaryen banner. I think if we don't see the personal heraldry, it may be because they simply want to keep the iconography consistent across all the shows, as to not confuse more casual viewers about who's who. Finn Bennett's Aerion Targaryen did catch me a little bit off guard. He did nail the performance we've seen so far, the arrogance, the indifference. Just his look was something I wasn't really expecting. I think it might be the short hair. Most Targaryens we've seen on screen have had longer hair, and that's kind of how I imagined Aerion. In fact, even the official art depicts him that way. But the short hair does make him stand out greatly, given the only other times we see a Targaryen with short hair is Daemon for a couple of episodes of House of the Dragon Season 1. His costume is also very standout. I'm not sure how I feel about the sleeveless shirt, but I like how the fashion seems to be very different than in House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. I guess these are all supposed to be different time periods. Different fashion sensibilities would make sense. Tanzell and the Puppet Show also really jumped out at me on my first viewing of the trailer. The actress seems spot on in terms of casting, but what caught me off guard was actually the puppet show itself. When I was reading the books, I was imagining something very different. I was thinking smaller puppets, kind of like Punch and Judy. So the scale of the dragon puppet really surprised me, but not in a bad way. I think it's been done really well. It's funny on Twitter at the moment, if you go into the replies, anything about the trailer, so many people are either complaining that they had said there was going to be no dragons and that was a lie, or this dragon CGI looks awful and goofy. So I guess if you don't know the story of the show and the puppets, it's good enough to catch some people out. We get a very brief look at Baelor Targaryen. In fact, he was not in the trailer near as much as I thought he would be, given how important his role in the story is. But I am pleased they stuck with his brown hair. I was very worried they might pull a Rhaenys in House of the Dragon and change his hair colour to Targaryen silver, just to make him more recognisable as a Targaryen to a more casual viewer. We also get a brief look at Stefan and Raymond Fossaway. Now, I actually really enjoy these two characters in the book, and their dynamic, so I'm glad they'll be given some sort of role in the show, and to me indicates they are going to be building up a lot of these more minor characters who take part in the Trial of Seven, which I think is vital in getting the audience truly invested in it. When Daniel Ings was announced as Lionel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm, I was not 100% sold on it. It was not really what I had pictured in my head. But from what we've seen so far, he very much seems to be every bit the Laughing Storm we know from the books. I can really see the vision the casting director had now. In fact, I would say he was one of the more standout parts of the trailer, and I really liked this portrayal so far. On a side note, I was also really pleased he did have an antlered helm. I don't know why, but the moment we see Duncan's newly painted shield for the first time kind of did get me a bit emotional. I really do love these stories, and they do mean a lot to me. So to see characters I love that much come to life on screen means a lot, and I really hope they don't mess it up. But what I will say is the painted shield is a lot more detailed than I thought it would be. But when you recall Tanzel's talent for painting, it would make sense that Dunk's shield is done exceptionally well. When Game of Thrones has done a lot of battles in the past, they tended to omit the fact a lot of the combat was on horseback and not foot. So I was concerned that Knight of the Seven Kingdoms was going to omit a lot of the jousting elements, and perhaps even do the whole Trial of Seven on foot. So I was glad to see just how promising the jousting and horseback combat seemed to be. The armour in the HBO shows has always been a bit hit and miss and questionable. Sometimes it's really well done. Sometimes it looks like it's made of paper. But what I will say with Aerian's armour, while it's still very pulled back compared to the book version, I do appreciate what they're trying to do with it. It does look very different and does stand out. It seems a good blend of HBO's more realistic aesthetic and the book's more whimsical take on armour. I do like how Aerian's helmet is a mixture of human and dragon, and reflects Aerian's storyline and his whole being a dragon in human form thing. So it's a really good nod to that. I love seeing both sides of the trial line up like they did. All I can say is the combat looks really brutal, and the action really seems to have weight to it. When someone gets hit, you can feel it. The weapons seem to have weight to them as well, if that makes sense. Sometimes when you watch Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, it can seem the swords and other weapons are light, like a toy lightsaber, if that makes sense. Where with this, it's like they have some real force and mass behind them. The jousting we've seen so far isn't just a massive of exploding lances. It really feels like we are watching a really deadly display of sport, or the action comes across as dynamic and fluid. And I think the use of drone cameras during the trial scenes is really going to add to that. I really like what I've seen so far from this trailer, and I am cautiously optimistic about what this show has to offer. I have a gut feeling that if they do indeed actually adapt the book how it's supposed to be, book fans are going to love this. I'm very much getting season 1 of Game of Thrones vibes, which in my opinion is a good thing, kind of back to basics, and why many people first fell in love with this IP. I do wonder though if it is going to be a more hard sell to a casual audience. There is going to be lots of action in this show, but just not in the way more casual audience have become accustomed to with the later seasons of Game of Thrones and now House of the Dragon. While the action is going to be smaller scale, I think it's going to be a lot more dirty and a lot more brutal than anything we've seen before. I think if you can hook people with that first episode, get them invested in the characters and story, the lack of dragons and magic isn't really going to matter in the end. Now I can understand people's frustration that season 1 is going to be 6 30-minute episodes. I too am frustrated with waiting 2 years for 8 episodes of mediocre TV. I understand why the industry has had to move this way post-COVID, but I do think it's become a large issue that needs to be addressed, and I do think it did damage House of the Dragon greatly. A lot of the momentum and hype and goodwill built up from season 1 of House of the Dragon was lost very quickly with the second season, with the 2-year wait, then lackluster start. The then mixed and questionable reaction to season 2 after such a long wait only made this issue worse. If this was any other show, if this was House of the Dragon season 3, or the Aegon's Conquest spin-off, or any other spin-off they have in mind for this IP, the episode count and runtimes would greatly concern me. But in this one case with A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, 6 episodes is the perfect amount for me. When the show was first announced, there were some rumours the initial pitch was 3 2-part specials, 1 for each book, with each special being 2 hour-plus long episodes. Kind of like how the final seasons of Sherlock worked. In my view, while you could have adapted the story in so few episodes, there would have been no room to expand and things would have needed to be very streamlined. Now, it works the other way around. If they did indeed do 10 or 12 episodes, they would have had to have added so much new and original content that in turn it would slow down the pace of the story. With 6 episodes, you have more than enough time to adapt the story without needing to make any cuts to it, while at the same time leaving yourself a bit of wiggle room if there are things you do need to expand upon. Remember here, Duncan is our only point of view in the story, and there are things that will happen off screen without Duncan present that the audience will need to understand and see. So I do think 6 episodes is that middle ground between too few and too long, between rushed and slow. Don't get me wrong, I wholeheartedly agree about the length of TV seasons in 2025, but in this case, with this story, in this specific circumstance, I think it does make sense. They will also be filming season 2 and 3 back to back, which should mean we will not have to be waiting 2 years between each season of the show. I am very hopeful for A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, but we have been burned by HBO a lot recently, so I am approaching the show with an air of caution. I hope it isn't bait and switch. I hope this really is the true adaptation the showrunner and everyone involved keeps talking about, that George R. R. Martin was so pleased about in his blog post, and I hope this isn't all just marketing to try and buy viewers' trust.